Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Just wanted to say hello. We will give it just a few minutes for people to connect, and then we'll go ahead and get started with today's webinar. In case people are wanting to, or in case people prefer to have interpreted French, English, or Arabic in simultaneous interpretation is available. So please, if you see at the bottom of the screen, there is a little panel for interpretation. If you click on that, you can choose which language you prefer to hear. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. People will likely join as we go along. So welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Ayesha Kadir. I'm a pediatrician and senior humanitarian health advisor for Save the Children International. And I have the honor of moderating today's webinar on the science behind caring for young children, strengthening nurturing care approaches to achieve better health outcomes. This is the first of a three-part webinar series that is hosted by the Global Health Cluster and co-organized by the Child Health Task Force, the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, and the World Health Organization. So I just wanted to go through a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our first speaker. We have quite a few participants that have registered for this. So we're really very excited and welcoming your participation, but we would like to ask that you keep your audio and video disabled throughout the session. What we'll do is we'll first hear from both of our presenters, and then we'll move into a discussion section. So we will be monitoring the Q&A. So we have a little, at the very bottom of your screen, you'll see a button for Q&A. So if you have any comments or any questions, please post them there, and we will do our best to address all of them as we go forward with the webinar today. And we have simultaneous interpretation in Arabic, French, and Spanish. So you can choose a channel in the panel below. And also instructions for how to access the language channel will be available in, I think will be available in the chat. The chat has otherwise been closed. It's only going to the hosts so that we can really focus on Q&A. And at the end of the session, we're recording this session, and we will share the recording of this webinar with registrants by email. So yeah, I think maybe now we can go ahead, and we'd like to introduce our first speaker, James Cairns, who will talk about the leveraging science to support children and families in crisis settings. So Mr. Cairns is Senior Director for Strategic Engagements and Organizational Learning at Harvard University's Center on the Developing Child. He leads center-wide efforts focused on understanding the early childhood ecosystem and the center's role in this, including developing strategic collaborations and partnerships and leading efforts to understand and measure the impact of our work. He also continues to provide strategic guidance to the center's international portfolio and partnerships. Before joining the Center on the Developing Child, James served as the Director of Programs at the World Conference of Religions for Peace and as the Director of Advocacy and Action for Children Program. He holds master's degrees in international relations and theology from Yale University and a bachelor's degree in government from Harvard University. Over to you, James.
Thank you very much, Ayesha. Welcome all. It's a pleasure to be with you for this conversation. You have heard who I am. So I am at the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, and it's been a pleasure to be part of this effort over the last decade plus as we work to expand the commitment, resources, and efforts to ensure healthy child development in places around the world. So what I want to do...
I'm just going to interrupt you because I think somebody's unmuted themselves. So just ask the participants, please stay off camera and on mute for the duration of the webinar. And we will have a Q&A via the chat at the end. Sorry, James. All right, go ahead.
No worries. Thank you. So I want to look at some of the kind of underlying science around early development and how that can help us think about better strategies for supporting children and families in the kinds of crisis and emergency settings that are the focus of this webinar and this series. As you heard from my bio, I am not a research scientist. And so a lot of what our center does is not its own research. We are a place that brings together and synthesizes the rich and ever-growing knowledge base from across multiple disciplines of research and science, and works to translate and share that in ways that are accessible and usable for those who are on the front lines of shaping policy, programs, and services for young children and their families. I want to do three things in my time here. I'm going to talk a little bit about some biology. I'm then going to set that biology in the context of broader environments, and then look at how all of that can help us think and shape a strategy around promoting and supporting resilience. So, what do we know? First, what's our challenge? We know that the prenatal to 3 period is that one with the most rapid brain development and other bodily systems, and it's setting a foundation for lifelong learning behavior and health. It's not setting outcomes, but we're setting foundations and often trajectories. In the context of this webinar series and what we're focused on, we know that the protracted nature of many emergencies means millions of children are actually spending their entire childhood in crisis and displaced settings. And that too often our humanitarian response system is not set up with a focus on developmental timing, which is what I'm now going to talk about a little bit. So we know that brains are built over time. At birth, our brains have all of the neurons they're ever going to have, but very few connections. And so what's happening is, in the environment of relationship and in the early experiences that children have, we are literally building the brain. That those synapses and those connections are being made, and it's shaping the architecture of the brain. And so all of the experiences we have, good and bad, are shaping these kind of connections. There's a lot of proliferation early, and we're building simple circuits and skills as a base, and then later on more complex things built on top of that. So we can think of this as sort of like a house. We're building a foundation, and the stronger that foundation is, the more effective what is built on top of it will be, and the sturdier it will be, and the more effective in terms of adapting and coping with life. Why is early experience so important? So this graph is a conceptual model, and we're talking about the idea of brain plasticity. So as I was saying, early on, there is a high level of adaptability and flexibility as those circuits are being wired. Over time, the brain prunes away what it's not using, so it's becoming more efficient. And I know all of us immediately went and looked at the horizontal axis and found our age on this graph. So don't worry, it never goes to zero. But what we do know is over time, the trade-off is the more efficient the brain is becoming, the more effort it takes to modify and rewire that brain architecture. And so this is telling us that what we do early, and by early we mean prenatal to 3, we're not talking 4, 5, 6, that's important, but that's not early. The more efficient and the better outcomes we're likely to have. The good news is, as I said, that yellow line never goes to 0. So there's always an opportunity here to adapt, to improve, to work on things. And for all of us that are sort of on the later end of this continuum of age, if I say something today that you didn't know before and you wake up tomorrow morning and remember it, you've built a new synapse in your brain. So all is not lost. So that's why we need to think very clearly about early. That also then reflects timing. When children are exposed to certain kinds of events, and in the case of the frame of this webinar, displacement, crisis, highly stressful and adverse situations, timing matters. Again, that if this is happening to an infant or 1-year-old when we're in that period of high plasticity and we're setting sort of sensitive periods in brain development, there's greater risk for influence and effect. If this event is happening to a 6 or 7-year-old, there's a little more that's already been developed. And if it's an adolescent, while there are still critical threats and challenges, again, so we have to think early, but we also have to think about the timing of when different kinds of events, good or bad, are happening in a child's life. So a lot of what our center has talked about over the years, and you're hopefully familiar with things like toxic stress and so forth. And so we've known and talked for years about the impact of stress on the brain. And so we know that learning how to cope with adversity is important. Short-lived sort of stressors are actually sort of helpful in us all building our coping mechanisms, as long as they're buffered by consistent supportive adult caregiving. This is what's triggering in us that kind of fight, flight, or freeze response. And so we've talked a lot about the brain and the impact of excessive stress activation over time on brain circuitry, on learning, on things like this. There's a rapidly growing body of knowledge that we're now putting together to understand that all of this that we know about stress and its effect is happening actually on multiple biological systems in the body, and that these systems are actually interacting in a highly integrated way. You can think of them as a team, each highly skilled in their own way, but interacting in response to environmental stressors and other things. So we can think about the work that the heart and cardiovascular system does, the metabolic system, the immune system, the neuroendocrine system. And again, all of these are tuned to respond to threat in an acute short-term situation. The challenge is, if that response is elevated over time, we start to see a very corrosive effect biologically and in the brain. One example here, one of the things our immune system does is produce kind of inflammatory reactions to get ready to fight against infection or wound. Very important in the short term. What we see, though, is if that inflammatory process, if you will, is extended over time, chronic inflammation is a precursor to a wide range of chronic health problems, including things like dementia. So what we're trying to say here is, when we're focused on supporting families and young children, it's as much about building a foundation for lifelong health outcomes as it is about learning, social emotional development, and school readiness. So we need to understand that we're talking about integrated biological systems, and that what we're doing is as important for health outcomes as it is for learning outcomes. So that's the biology. I want to now set this in a slightly broader context. You may, if you're familiar with our center, we released a new working paper about 6 months ago called Place Matters. And we're starting now to kind of bring some other bodies of knowledge into the conversation around child development. And so looking at not just this environment of relationships between caregivers and children that are part of the core of building this brain architecture and these coping capacities, but now setting it in some other environments. So the social environment, these are the things that we've been talking a lot about in the child development arena for a while. Influences of responsive relationships, this question of like what's happening with stress, attention to caregiver well-being, the role that community support and faith and cultural conditions can play. But now let's bring in, again, not new research, but collecting growing bodies of knowledge about the way that the built and natural environment has effects on child health and developmental outcomes. And we can look at things like air quality and temperature. There's what excessive heat does to sleep patterns, to all kinds of other things, access to water that's drinkable, green space. Are people living in healthy and safe housing? Is there food available? And you can see that these kinds of things are important in normal, quote unquote, neighborhoods and communities. These become even more critical in terms of when we're looking at the settings in which people are living in situations of displacement and emergency. And then finally, we have the set of the broader systemic and, if you will, historic kinds of influences. And here's where we understand that structural inequity, other kinds of exclusion and discrimination, the historic policies that our societies have put in place, how those affect disparities in access to health care, quality education. And so we need to see that the biology of the individual child and how it interacts with its environment is being shaped by these other factors. And again, I think trying to see how these come to bear in crisis, displacement, and emergency settings, and how we understand the way we need to respond and in these kinds of issues is critical. So let's now take all of this and think about the idea of resilience and the science behind this concept. And so this is a definition, but that what we're talking about here is a positive and adaptive response in the face of the significant hardship or adversity. And so a couple of really critical elements here. Resilience is built over time. It is not a trait. And I think too often we talk about people being resilient or not resilient. And I think what we understand from the research and the science is that it's an interactive process between the factors in our social environments and our own biology, and how our biological systems are responsive to those factors. And so the foundation of this is a combination of the supportive relationships, which you've heard as a constant theme through what I've been saying, adaptive skill building, coping mechanisms and strategies, and positive experiences in the environment around kids and families. And a final point here is resilience can be situation specific. It's not necessarily a generalizable outcome. I might be able to cope and do very well with a lot of stress and adversity in my professional life. And that same stress and adversity might be causing significant long-term health problems for me at the same time. So that there are parts of us in certain contexts and in certain ways we respond to stress where we can demonstrate some strong resilience. And there might be other areas of our lives and contexts where that's not the case. And so it's not a trait, it's not fixed, and it's not a blanket result. I think it's helpful to think of resilience as a scale, as a metaphor in terms of what we understand from the science behind this. And so we can think that on one side of that scale are negative experiences and outcomes. In this situation, displacement, poverty, inequity. So those are weighing on a negative side of the scale. On the other side are some positive experiences and factors. How we strengthen the skills and agency of children. Again, the responsive relationships. Are children in an environment where they have consistent, supportive, and caring adult relationships? What kinds of services, social capital are available for a family? And the faith and cultural traditions. And often I feel like these things are overlooked sometimes when we talk about the science and biology and things like this. But there's a strong body of evidence that access to and participation in the cultures of our societies, our faith communities, they offer a couple of factors in terms of sort of managing sort of adversity and stress, meaning making, identity, belonging, and these things are all actually really important as we talk about foundational components of resilience. So there's another part of this model here, though. It's not just the positive and negative sides of a scale. It's also the fulcrum in the middle. And what we know about this is we can think of it as being set at start by some of our genetic predispositions. Think of this as temperament. We're different. And so our sort of biological sort of starting point in terms of sensitivity to our environment will differ. And so depending on where that fulcrum is set, as you saw with the slide shift, it can sort of determine how that balance between positive and negative turns out. Now, the good news is that that fulcrum is not fixed. It might have a starting point, but it's not a permanent location, if you will, on that balance. And so there are ways to shift the fulcrum, particularly in terms of building coping skills, agency, these kinds of things actually help shift that balance. So this is not a fixed model. Again, there are ways in which influence, environment, skills, practices can influence sort of how the result and how we can promote resilient outcomes. And I think this is particularly important as we understand the environments in which we're talking about today. One last thing about this model of resilience. Sometimes we don't often talk explicitly about the who or the what that is acting on this scale. And so if we're not clear about that, the danger is that we can default to a frame that is really all about the family level. And so we put a lot of unfair burden or expectation often on parents and caregivers who themselves are facing significant levels of adversity caused by outside forces and somehow feeling like they're responsible for whether or not we're getting resilient outcomes for their children. And so I think we need to look at what is acting, if you will, on different parts of this scale. So we've talked about family and community supports. If they're present, how are those helping sort of add to the positive side of this story? Similarly with programs and services. But we have to be careful because sometimes the programs and services can add adversity or challenges in terms of how people access them. Are they sensitive to culture and language and so forth? So, but hopefully we're running programs that are, again, adding to these positive things. As I talked earlier about the impact of the physical and built environment, often, again, these can have positive and negative sort of impacts, as can some of the systemic issues that we're talking about. And so we need to be able to understand sort of what it is that is influencing the experiences of children and families in different environments. Now, to close out and move from the kind of conceptual to a little bit more practical, we're really thinking about sort of three principles that are based in science that are ways in which we can think about how the work that we do and how we're engaging with kids and families in these settings can be supportive of building resilience. How are we able to reduce sources of significant stress? Again, in displacement, there are significant stressors. The large scale ones we may not be able to alleviate in the short term, but in the day-to-day, how are we helping reduce the stress of those environments? How are we supporting responsive relationships in situations where the parents and caregivers are experiencing as much or more adversity than the children in these environments? What else are we doing to sort of buffer and support those relationships when parents are struggling? And how are we looking at what are we doing in terms of the ability to strengthen these adaptive skills, opportunities for agency, for basic sort of skill building and feeling of some kind of control over some aspect of a parent or a child's life. These are interrelated, and they can push on each other in a variety of ways. And so I'll close, and as I hand off to our next speaker, who's going to talk more explicitly about this. So we have these three principles grounded in the science that I've been talking about, and what we know about how human development happens and what threatens its positive trajectory, and connecting that to the nurturing care framework. Not a 1-to-1 ratio, 3-to-5 here, but again, that this science is foundationally undergirding the components of nurturing care in terms of how do we ensure a stable environment that is sensitive to health and nutritional needs, protecting from threat as much as possible, creating opportunities for learning and responsive caregiving. All of these aspects of how we understand our approach to working with young kids and families are what works together to build resilience. If you're not familiar with our center, this is our website. There is plenty more material on all of the topics I've been touching on here. So I encourage you to go take a dive in our website. And with that, I will conclude my presentation for now. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to have this opportunity, and we'll look forward to some question and discussion in the next stage of this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. This was really a really succinct and powerful overview that kind of sort of strikes home the importance of all the different aspects of a child's life and how that pervasively affects their growing bodies and all the organ systems. So building brains, but building bodies and building futures. And how all of this actually goes back to health work, because this is, at the end of the day, what we would call bread and butter pediatrics. This is a pediatric issue, a clinical issue, as much as it is other sort of all the other sectors that are intervening. So this kind of brings home the importance of where we're moving now to try and integrate our programs. So I think it's a really great transition to go now to Sheila Manji. Ms. Manji is our next speaker. She's an early child development specialist with the World Health Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. Sheila's worked on issues related to early child development in the education and health sectors for over 15 years. She's supported governments, communities, UN agencies, philanthropic organizations, and civil society organizations to develop contextually appropriate solutions that enable children to thrive. With WHO, her areas of work include supporting implementing the nurturing care framework, working with partners to develop advocacy and operational materials that can advance attention to and investment in early child development, and in strengthening health systems to provide quality care for caregivers and their young children. So the title of her talk today is From Science to Action, Nurturing Care for Children Living in Humanitarian Settings. Over to you, Sheila.
Thanks, Ayesha. Just getting the slides going. There we go. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being with us today. It's nice to see us looking through the list of participants, lots of people I know from around the world who have been part of this conversation for quite some time, who are well-versed in the science and also well-versed in this concept of nurturing care, but also a lot of new friends to this conversation. And we hope that through the two presentations today and also through the discussion, you'll come away feeling like this is something I want to learn more about. And as I go back and think about my work, that I think about how I can give more attention to the youngest children in our world. So I'm going to focus and build on what James presented, which is this concept of nurturing care. That's where he left off. But as you will see, it very much connects to what James was talking about in terms of how do we build resilience? How do we protect children from adversity? How do we help them cope with adversity and be a buffer and build resilience? And nurturing care is a way that we can do that. But also, as James said, it's not enough just to focus on the child and ensuring that we support the youngest children. We also need to think about what are all the different influencers or influences in the child's life and in the caregiver's life. And so we talk about it in the frame of enabling environments, but as you will see, it is identical to what James was talking about just now. So let's start with this concept of nurturing care. So we talk about nurturing care as something that we do. It's an approach that we want to ensure all children receive nurturing care, and that when we are successful, then we are contributing to that child's early development. Now, a lot of the evidence that you heard from the biology side of things that James presented, as well as other evidences, have been pulled together in the Lancet series from 2017, Advancing Early Childhood Development from Science to Scale. And it was the authors of this series that coined the term nurturing care. And that concept called nurturing care then informed the development of the nurturing care framework, which was launched in 2018. So the framework, which is the document, the larger document that encompasses the concept nurturing care, but also includes other things like the strategic actions and the guiding principles to take forward our efforts and ensure that children receive nurturing care. This framework is a roadmap that outlines why efforts must begin in the earliest years, from pregnancy to age 3. And you heard earlier why we need to focus on that age group. How nurturing care protects children from the worst effects of adversity, and what caregivers need in order to provide nurturing care. So let's get into this concept of nurturing care. I've left you hanging a little bit there. So there's 5 components: interrelated, indivisible. All 5 have to happen. And if we think about where children, the youngest children from pregnancy to age 3, what kinds of services are they accessing? It is typically the health and nutrition services. So while we say that it's really important for caregivers to provide their children nurturing care, we say it's the health and nutrition sector that has a very important role to play in supporting caregivers to do that. And so what we'll look at now is, well, what does this mean? How do we think about this, these 5 components individually? On the link that's on the bottom of the screen, which we can also share later with you, you'll find the core definitions for each of these 5 components. We'll look at them a little bit more deeply in terms of what it means in a crisis setting. But just to give you a summary here, your health and nutrition is what you would automatically expect: the physical and mental well-being of the child as well as their caregiver. The nutrition, so is there adequate nutrition for the child and their caregiver? Safety and security, free from physical, emotional dangers. Early learning, and here in this context, because we're focusing on the youngest child before age 3, it's not exclusively looking at early learning in the context of center-based programs or early childhood education or preschool. It's also thinking about what are the learning opportunities that are provided by caregivers and others that are taking care of the child. So things like, does the child have access to materials they can play with? Does someone talk to them? Does someone play with them? Does someone sing to them? Are they hearing language? All of these things are underneath that concept of early learning. And then responsive caregiving, or responsive relationship, as James referred to it, is this idea of, is there someone in the child's life that understands and is able to respond to the child's needs? So do they understand if the child is showing signs of hunger or of fear? And are they noticing those signs and able to respond to them? And this concept of responsive caregiving underpins these 5 components of nurturing care. We say that if a caregiver is responsive, they're more likely to be able to provide the other 4 components of nurturing care, because they're more aware of if there might be an issue of illness or an issue of safety on the horizon. So let's look at what it might mean in an acute situation and an onset of a crisis. what might we be trying to think about to ensure that the 5 components of nurturing care are there in all the different facets that we might think about in the different services that we have. So for health, one of the first things that happens in the onset of a crisis is there's difficulty accessing essential health services. And so we want to make sure those are in place, that we minimize the disruptions, and that we think about first aid or basic emotional and psychological support for the caregiver's mental health. Nutrition, continued access to nutritious food, continuous promotion of breastfeeding. Safety and security, we want to make sure that there's shelter, that there's warmth, that there's adequate, accessible, and safe water and hygiene facilities. We might think about cash transfers and child grants, and we also want to think about what are the strategies to minimize violence and stress. Early learning, as I mentioned before, this is thinking about the materials that children have access to, books or learning and play materials, or places where they can gather, or that the children of the frontline workers might be able to gather and be cared for, so that the frontline workers can support others. Or, for example, if parents are in lines waiting for food or other services, that they don't have to worry about losing their children in the middle of these crowds, but they know that there is somewhere that their children can be cared for, and that they can then focus on finding the things that they need. And then responsive caregiving here would mean preventing separation. And this aspect of caregiver stress, which James alluded to in his presentation, is kind of permeating through all of this. And not just the stress on the child, which is very important here, but also the stress on the caregiver, because if the caregiver is feeling stress or is worried about other things, they're going to be less able to focus on the child. And that stress that the caregiver is feeling is going to be conveyed to the child. So these are some of the things. There may be other things that may come to your mind as you think about this, but this is in an acute situation. If we think about a more long-term protracted crisis, then we're starting to think about these are individuals that are now here for a longer period, and what are other things that we could be thinking about for these families and their young children. So here it's for health, it's about preventing, managing illness. It could mean developmental monitoring and counseling to identify children at risk of suboptimal development or those that might be experiencing delays or disabilities. And it could include psychosocial support for caregivers. Adequate nutrition, it includes food security, preventing and managing malnutrition, as well as counseling on infant and young child feeding. Safety and security, again, issues of financial security, not just the physical security, is there a home, but also financial security. So thinking about the livelihoods of the caregivers. Practicing good hygiene, child protection, supporting families that may have high levels of stress. People may be dealing with loss of family members, loss of jobs. And so how do we ensure, or traumas that are appearing, how do we support families, the caregivers and the children through that process? And then alleviating any family conflicts. For opportunities for early learning, it's looking at what are the culturally relevant and developmentally appropriate play and learning materials that are for that age group. So it will differ depending on the ages that you want to work with. But are there places where children can gather? Are there places where caregivers can gather with their children or on their own to receive some guidance and support, and supporting children with disabilities? And the last thing around responsive caregiving is now that there is hopefully less of a immediate stress, and now it's more about how am I going to navigate this situation that I'm in, is reinforcing and working with families to have those positive and responsive interactions with their children. In doing so, when James was showing you that scale of the negative outcomes and the positive outcomes, when we start doing all of these things, we're moving in that direction of positive outcomes and we're building resilience. So this aspect of responsive caregiving and early learning, these are newer concepts that have emerged since this concept of nurturing care was coined in 2017. And the World Health Organization has developed a guideline, Improving Early Childhood Development, which emphasizes that these two components need to be supported and integrated into health and nutrition services everywhere. So we want to see that in every health and nutrition service, caregivers are receiving support on how to be responsive caregivers, or reinforced and praised if they're already doing that, reminded and shown that this is something that's beneficial for their child and something that is good to continue. The early learning also, are they giving support and guidance on how to play with their child, talk with their child? Do they understand that this is important? Do they understand that the brain is developing so rapidly in this period and we cannot wait until the child is older, or that there is more stability and certainty to start thinking about those things, that we, even in the circumstances that they are in, that already needs to be addressed. And then you'll see the last one here is around supporting maternal mental health, because as we've talked about, if the caregivers are under stress, they are going to find it more challenging to be able to care for their children. So we have the 5 components of nurturing care, but then around it now we have this concept of caregiver well-being. So if we want the children to receive those 5 indivisible components of nurturing care, we also have to be thinking about, how are we supporting the caregivers? How are we supporting their physical and mental health? How are we alleviating all the stress in their lives, whether that's physical stress, mental stress, financial stress, food stress, trauma based on someone they've lost in their lives, all the stresses in their lives that come with the displacement or a new environment. How are we helping them navigate that so that they can bring some stability and comfort in their home with their children? So we've heard and we've talked about how children are at the center. We want to make sure that they are receiving nurturing care, that they're receiving all those opportunities and experiences and the positive brain building experiences, but that we need the caregivers to be able to provide that for their children. And then, as we heard from James, we can't rely on just the caregivers, because the caregivers are being impacted by all the other layers around them. And so here it's a slightly different diagram from what you saw before, but saying essentially the same thing. If we want caregivers to be able to support their children and provide their children nurturing care, we have to think about all the other influencers from what is happening in the communities. Are the communities child friendly? Are there voices included in the design and delivery of interventions? Is there access to services? And here, if we think about how services are organized in a particular context, are they connected? Are they working together so that as a cohesive unit, they are supporting that family and child? And then what are the policies that are in place? And in this case, what are the humanitarian response plans? How are children and families being reflected in these plans, or how could they be reflected better going forward? So the short story here is that it isn't just the responsibility of a single sector or a single stakeholder group. All of us are working with families and young children. All of us want to see children survive and thrive. All of us want to see stability in the context where these children are living. And we all have to think about, what is our part? How can we contribute to that? How can we use our existing platforms or the work that we are already doing and refine it with a lens of what am I doing for the youngest children? And what can I do better or differently going forward so that the youngest children are not left behind? So we have this adage that we use of remember, strengthen, and add. You'll see it in many of the different nurturing care publications, because it's to say that a lot of what you are doing is already contributing to nurturing care. It's already contributing to what children need so that they can survive and thrive. But sometimes we don't think about it in that lens. So what I would encourage you to do as a first step is to take a look at what you're already doing and think about, is anything that I'm doing actually contributing to children's development? Is anything that I'm doing contributing to alleviating caregiver stress or creating the right conditions for our caregivers to be able to care for their children? And then you start thinking about, well, what else could I be doing? Where are the gaps? And what are things that I could be doing on my own or with others? So first off is looking at the various services that are often available or should be available. And not all of these will be available at the onset of a crisis, but hopefully in the event of a protracted crisis, you would start to see more and more of these. So looking at the various entry points, the various services that are available that span that spectrum of nurturing care. So are there things like essential newborn care? Are there things like promoting breastfeeding? Is there birth registration? Is there safe water and sanitation? Are there safe places for children to play? Are there opportunities for children to have access to toys, or not necessarily store-bought toys, but things that can be made using materials in the environment. Often we think of toys as things we need to go and buy from a store, but anyone who has had a child and has seen a child with a cardboard box knows that children think everything is a toy. So it's not necessarily about going and creating large boxes of toys, but about thinking about having materials available to children. We developed a publication with UNICEF, the International Rescue Committee, as well as the two partner associations, the Early Childhood Development Action Network and the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn and Child Health, because we recognize that you have to think about what does nurturing care look like? What can we do in the context of a humanitarian setting? And the brief gives you examples of things you can do at the level of policies, at the level of services, communities, and caregivers. It's organized around that remember, strengthen, add, and I've just pulled out a few here to say, well, what might that look like in an onset of a crisis, in an acute setting, and what might we be focusing on in a protracted crisis? These are just some of the examples that are given in this brief, so they're not the full list. But the first in an acute setting is to make sure that the services that are there continue, the ones that we were just looking at. And we talked earlier about the essential health services, making sure that there's minimal disruptions and that services can continue. And that there's places where children can feel safe, where caregivers and children can feel safe together. In a protracted crisis, you're now starting to think about strengthening and adding to what you're doing. So the policies and plans, do they give attention to the youngest children? Is there financing for the kinds of interventions that are needed? Do you include the voices of various stakeholders in the planning and the assessment and the implementation of your responses? And then what might be the capacity needs of those workers that are interacting with caregivers and young children? What kinds of capacity or capacities might they need to better be able to support caregivers to find access to their own resources, to alleviate their own stress or get their own support, as well as what kind of capacities might they need to be able to support caregivers to provide their children nurturing care? Another resource that you might find useful is this one from the Moving Minds Alliance, which provides a list of 7 things to be thinking about. So some of these overlap with what's in the previous document, but again, it's this idea of how are we, if you look at number 3, how are we working together? How can we think about what each of us is doing in our sector or in our agency and bring that together into something more cohesive that wraps around that family? And then similarly, number 6 is like what I said before, how do we involve the different stakeholders in the design and delivery of the response? Going back to James, what James was saying around how do we make sure that we reflect the cultural traditions, the faith practices that are important to the families that we are working with. So I'll leave you with just this sampling of different resources. Obviously, I won't go into it here, but to say that there are many materials that you could look into to think about what are steps that I could take to strengthen the work that I'm doing now. We've also done a couple of other video presentations on this topic in the past, and you can find them at the link below. And that same link, you'll also find a number of other presentations that go into much more depth around the nurturing care framework and the 5 strategic actions that are there to support implementation of that framework. So for now, I'll stop, invite you to look at the nurturing care website, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. This is, again, a really wonderful presentation, and I think it kind of drives home all the different elements that we see and we work with in our health response, but we don't necessarily see it as part of our health response. I'll get to that in just a moment. But one thing that I really struck me was the focus on play and safe play and learning spaces. And, you know, we know that children make sense of their experiences and learn through play. So this has been incorporated into child health care delivery, especially in high income settings, with an entire cadre of workers that are called play therapists. So, but there are now increasing examples, successful examples in humanitarian contexts, in outbreak, even in isolation and treatment centers where play is used in therapy. both as a way to help children cope with what they're experiencing. Also, it supports, it's actually a form of pain control in a way. It's extraordinary, and it is how they learn. So it's so important. So thank you for this. Before we move into the Q&A, just want to remind everyone there's a little button at the bottom of the screen that says Q&A. You can please, you're very welcome to post questions or comments or reflections there, and we will share them with the group. And I'd also like to remind everyone that this is the first webinar in a 3-part series. Our next webinar is on the 18th of October. And we will talk about programming and action, nurturing care, integrated into national health systems. And so we'd like to invite you to join and to come with your own examples to share with us so that we can discuss together the successes, the challenges, and the ways to overcome these. And then our last webinar on the 9th of November, we'll discuss with the health cluster coordinators how to institutionalize nurturing care and humanitarian health interventions. And this is with a goal to make it a routine and standard part of humanitarian health and integrated responses. I just wanted to kind of underline the importance of recognizing nurturing care as an approach to promote early child development, to promote healthy early child development. So they're not the same thing. Nurturing care is a way to enable healthy or to promote healthy early child development. So I'd like to invite James and Sheila to come back on screen, and we'll start off our Q&A. And when I think maybe I would like to start off with a question for both of you. In humanitarian health responses, especially in the early phases of a response, health teams tend to focus on immediately life-saving measures for life-threatening diseases or illnesses or injuries. And so we look at what might kill a person and try to address that, what for today or for tomorrow, what's coming in the door and what we see just around the corner. But even though crises are becoming more protracted, it's often left for someone else to think about what might happen a few months or years down the road. We're not thinking so far because we have so much going on right now. And what this might mean for example, children and their families months or years in the future. So we do things like we replenish medical supplies and equipment, and we set up field hospitals and do mobile clinics. And for children, we do vaccination campaigns. We don't yet have a large cohort of pediatricians or pediatric nurses or child health professionals who are deploying or who are living. Very rarely do we have child health professional, a large cohort of child health professionals in a crisis context. So when we talk about early child development as an urgent humanitarian health need, many health teams will wonder, well, what's the urgency compared with other needs? And they might question if early child development is truly essential in a health response, in a humanitarian health response, especially in the early phases. So what would you say to them? I'll let you choose who wants to go.
Let me say a couple of things I think there are two things here that are as much about mindset and awareness as they are about practice. And so the first is that what we know from developmental timing is all kids aren't the same. And so to be aware of what's happening if the child is 1, and as I was talking about plasticity and sequences of brain development and so forth, how that child is responding to what's happening and the risks and opportunities there are going to be different than if that child is 7 or 12 or 18. So that's one. And I think the other is this, that development doesn't stop. Now, I totally support that in crisis and life, saving the life is the most important thing. But I think there's a mindset that's sort of unconscious for a lot of us, which is this is sequential somehow. that you do the emergency thing, and then later we worry about that developmental trajectory. But that trajectory is going, right? That the brain development is happening day to day to day to day to day to day. So those two things are as much about mindset and attention to that reality of developmental process and timing as it is to any particular programmatic intervention or change in practice, if that makes sense. That's in some ways the most important thing I think we're talking about here.
I can add on there. I think this point, James, that you made of, development doesn't stop. And I think that is the key message, right? That even in a crisis situation, when there are so many things we need to be thinking about, that child is still developing. And you mentioned it in your presentation of it's every experience, the positive experience, the negative experience, or the absence of experience, all of those things are impacting on the child's developing brain. And so sometimes you see in a crisis situation, there's that loss of control, that loss of what am I going to do? But being able to understand that you still have something you can do, something you can contribute to your child, even in this situation, can be quite empowering. It can help the caregiver focus more on what I can do rather than what I can't do in this situation. And then, if I think about sometimes what's happening in the kinds of scenes that children are witnessing, whether they're witnessing them live or they're hearing about them because somebody is talking about them around them, or they're seeing scenes on the media because someone's watching the news. These are all forming an impression on the child on what this world is all about, right? And what it looks like. And as the child gets older, this becomes their normality. This is what they see as normal. And there is this risk there that, nobody's helping this child navigate what all this means and make meaning of it. So they're left to their own devices to make their own interpretations of that. But if we want to see a better world, a world that has less war, less conflict, a world where people are helping each other and working together more, even if we want to think about productivity, economic productivity, all of these things start in childhood. And so yes, I know that sometimes we get really focused on, okay, what is the short-term needs and solutions that we need to be thinking about? But there is also this need to really understand that the choices we're making now are influencing this generation and the generations to come.
Thank you so much. And I think wearing my pediatrician hat, I think also I would argue that what's happening now with development does make a difference, sometimes even tomorrow or next week, what comes through the door of that field hospital. So there is something there that we can reduce our workload if we try and promote healthy development and health. And it's not just the brain, but also the body, and the kinds of stuff we see going through the doors of our clinics and hospitals. Brilliant. We have some questions here. I wanted to just say one is, is this for James? Do you have any suggestions on how to bring these concepts of sort of the biology and the science behind early child development, how to bring these concepts to staff working with families who are not housed? So are there, and also a second question related to your presentation, are the materials that you shared, are there materials available that can be used directly?
Thanks. So we have a wide array of stuff on our website, from infographics and short videos and things. Some of them have been translated into other languages in different ways. So all of that is on our website. So for staff, I think in some ways, the three principles that I talked about at the end of my presentation are not highly technical. I think they can be explained in a way and we have a whole set of materials that we call our Science by Design, if you look on our website, which is sort of taking those principles and combining them with some other design approaches. But it's this idea that if we look at what we're doing on a day-to-day basis with children and families, what are we doing that's reinforcing those responsive relationships either with a caregiver directly, or if, as we've talked about, if the caregivers are struggling so much with their own, stress and trauma, or Sheila, you made the point, they have to be in line for half a day to get food or other materials. What we know from the biology is that that responsive relationship doesn't have to be with a parent. So if other staff and others are aware of, like, how are we cultivating an environment where that child feels responded to, safe, cared for. That could be a teacher, it could be someone in a play group, but there's a consistency of that relationship in that responsive environment. Second, what are we doing in any way that's trying to reduce the stress in the day-to-day immediate environment of that kid? The play groups are a way. I think coming back to do families have access and kids have access to things in their own language, in things that feel familiar to them? Are there ways that that child is feeling like it's building its own ability to do things, this kind of agency, in terms of then this kind of skill building piece of this? And with parents, like how are we working with parents? So I think staff don't need a 6-week technical course in brain development, but I think some of these basic principles and helping do some simple underlying explanation of that, it then gives us all kind of lenses, if you will. Like, okay, how is what we're doing either supporting these kinds of principles from what we know from the developmental science, or actually working against them inadvertently? So that's what I would say. But again, I think there are a lot of materials on our website, and there are plenty of materials that others have developed that are drawing on, consistent with this science, have made it very effectively accessible to a wide range of folks.
Thank you so much. And what we can do is, after this webinar series, we will follow up and share the link to the recording, and we can also share some links to some materials for people to use. And I think another one for James, actually, well, maybe I'll go to Sheila for one. We'll go back and forth. For Sheila, and somebody is writing, they noticed that maternal health was featured, and they were wondering about paternal or non-birthing parent health. Where does that person's needs fit in to the nurturing care framework?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's true that we've in the past we've had this association as the primary caregiver is the mother, right? But we also know that, as James was just saying, it's not a single caregiver that needs to be the focus, and we want to think about all the caregivers in that child's life. So the more responsive relationships, the better, but some consistency is key. So when it came to the guideline that I showed you, the Improving ECD WHO guideline, it's true that there it puts a spotlight on maternal mental health, because it's looking at what the evidence says, and that's where the evidence is right now, is around mothers. But if you saw what I said around caregivers, I think I was trying very carefully to consistently say caregivers rather than mothers. And then also this component we have on caregiver well-being, which then is thinking about whomever the caregiver is in that child's life. Whether it's the mother, the father, or someone else that is responsible for that child, that at minimum, that is the one person you want to make sure is doing well physically and mentally. But ideally, you would want to be supporting all the caregivers around that child.
Yeah, and I think our child protection colleagues also would have some thoughts about this, because I would say this again from a pediatric clinical perspective, what we see coming through the door of a health facility, parents, any caregiver who, like, we're not born with the knowledge of how to care for young children. This is something we learn, and health workers, even if they have children, are not necessarily experts in understanding how children are responding. They're not child health experts necessarily. So I think there's something about there's an important component of helping parents and caregivers and health workers to understand how children react, so they can, and why they're reacting in a way, so caregivers can support in a constructive and helpful way. Sometimes it can be difficult to understand why the child is wetting their bed, or why they're developmentally regressing, or why they're refusing to eat or acting out. And this can be not only an additional stress for the parent, but also it can be really it can actually predispose the child to further adversity. So, but there's an important component to helping the health workforce to recognize this and to do what's effectively a very low cost intervention. If we're already providing clinical care, if we can do anticipatory guidance, or sort of basically helping caregivers to understand how a child might react and how they can support them, something that they can control, often in a situation where they've lost control of a lot of aspects of their life. So yeah. Okay, so next question. They're coming in now, hot and fast. So thank you, James, for articulating well the science. Are you able to comment on any research on gender differences from negative or positive influences in early life? So are there gender differences in early child development around adversity, is how I understand that.
So I don't have sort of at my fingertips specific research on looking at that. I'm sure plenty of it has been done. I think the stronger piece here is individual difference, not necessarily gender difference. And so I think we'll see variability in terms of response to stress and to supportive factors that are running more around kind of, because there's this idea of heterogeneity, of individual difference. And so all of us are have a distinctive sensitivity to our environment and to threat, and sensitivity to intervention. And so I think as we look at environments, I think that might be when we get into some of these issues around kind of like what's happening in that broader social environment or this more systemic environment. Are there patterns that have been shaped in terms of how that environment treats girls and boys that probably is influencing those outcomes as much as the biology? So I think that the biology of difference is not gendered in that sense as extensively as, but this is all about the interaction between biology and environment, right? So I think that those are the places where that's going to happen. So that's what I would say, but I don't have at my fingertips specific sort of research or data looking at that, specifically. But conceptually, I think those are the things we need to be thinking about.
That makes a lot of sense. So much of the social environment, socially sort of gendered, constructed environment, but also the way that different genders face different risks will then, of course, interact with their developing bodies and brains and impact. I think maybe there's also, I don't know, James, what you think about this, but I think there's also a component of there's gendered risks, right? So, for example, in children associated with armed forces and armed groups, you have a gendered risk around the kinds of activities that these children are engaged in. So girls may be more likely to having to do cooking. They may be more likely, but not actually necessarily, more likely to be sexually abused and exploited. Boys are too, and they're often forgotten, which is why I said not necessarily. But there's certainly a higher prevalence of what we're aware of girls being used or and participating in that way, and boys are more likely to be involved in combat activities, for example. So, and those each carry different kinds of physical risks, for sure, psychological risks, but they would also carry developmental risks and physiological risks, for adversity and the adversity beyond that. Would that be fair to say?
I think that's fair. And I think what we're saying is that the body's responding to whatever threat or stress it's experiencing in its environment. So I think you're right. How those exposures are mediated by girls and boys, and again, the kind of social environments and how those things play out, I think is quite true.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And so I think this is one for both of you. How do you see the role of expanding technologies in areas of early child development and improving abilities to provide value in a crisis?
Maybe I'll start and then James, please come in. I think some of it, and we've been talking about this, is a bit of a mindset issue, right? Of how do we help everyone, not just the parents and caregivers, but the health workers and others that are working with the families, see the importance of children, not forgetting about children in these situations. And things like mass media could potentially help with creating that atmosphere that you want to create, so that children are seen in these images, that we are expressing or talking about things that people can be doing or why we need to be doing with and for children in these environments. Or even things like WhatsApp groups or SMS messages to caregivers, providing them with some reinforcement, some praise. You're not alone, you're here. Here's a place that you can go to get this kind of support, or here's something that you could try with your child where you are today. Things that especially making them feel that they're not alone in that environment, I think is such a risk that caregivers have lost their social support system, right? And who is helping them? Who is making them feel like they are seen and heard? Right. And so whether it's through SMSs or the WhatsApp groups or those kinds of technologies that keep you connected with a service or a person, but also connected with other parents or other people that are going through similar kinds of experiences. And then together can be problem solving what they can be doing to help their children.
Two very quick additions. I think the digital IT on the data side and access and shareability of information across, I mean, again, in a response where you've got sort of different agencies assigned to different parts of the response architecture, are there ways that then digitizing a lot of that kind of information and data is more shareable, which means that then responsive ability to work with families is improved, hopefully. I think the other thing is that I think we're still learning, but what is interactive digital media doing with kids and families? And if there's an opportunity for that to be a tool, a resource for positive interactions, watching a video or having an interactive game or something like that on a tablet or something like that, that creates a positive moment for child and caregiver. I think we're at the early stages of the research, but I think it's a very different dynamic than the passive watching of television, right? Which was the whole guidance for years. I know we've had students here, doctoral students here at Harvard and other places who are, I think the folks who are now really starting to dig into trying to understand what's the dynamic of the interactive digital media and technology. And I think it comes back to the relationship piece of it in particular.
Just to add on to that, the question actually also asked the second part of the question, which I did not say, asked about early childhood education and care. And I'm wondering about we think, nurturing care is an approach for all ages, but it's particularly one of the most powerful things about it is that it starts really from even before birth, helping the parent to understand some ways to protect and promote healthy development when the baby is born, but also throughout from the day that child is born. Whereas education programs are often aimed at children who are a little bit older. So they're that really critical period where a lot of physical development and growth and biological, meaning physiological changes in the body and the organ systems, changes that we see with how fast a child breathes and how quickly their heart beats, but also all the things they can do, from smiling socially to being able to sit up, to being able to crawl, put things in their mouth, put things they're not supposed to in their mouth, run around, and fall down or bump their head, and all the things that can impact their risks, of course. But this period, there's so much happening. And it's and there's so many social interventions that we can do to protect health and healthy development, but it's not necessarily seen as the role of a health worker to ask about that, or to maybe there's something around, I don't know, referral pathways, and understanding what risks are, giving parents some guidance, caregivers some guidance, but then also making sure we have referral pathways for additional help. Maybe this is the connection. This is probably the core in many ways, connection to other kinds of humanitarian response that is directed at families and at children specifically. But in early child education and care, that's an older group. It's usually kids from usually around 3 and above. And so the way you approach that and the kind of technology you would use or who it's directed at might be different. So we're probably not going to show a video to a 2-month-old, but we would do other things, right? So I wonder if you see a difference in the two, in the way they should be used for the different groups, or if we should maybe just think of it kind of as kids and their parents and make sure we're capturing the spectrum.
So I think you were just saying it, Ayesha, with the 2 different age groups there, right? So for the very, very young children, if we're using technologies, I would direct them more towards the caregivers. And it's around supporting the caregivers with what they can do with their children. Then if we're looking at the older age group, then there may be things that are more child focused. So things like television programs or radio broadcasts or radio shows, dramatizations and things where they can serve that role, because sometimes there may be an issue of not being able to provide access to a center or a space for early childhood education. So in the absence of a place where children can gather and there's no teacher or other person that can facilitate activities, but there is access to TV or radio that children can hear or see these kinds of programs or educational programs, which could then support more of that. I would still have a caregiver component to that, even at that older age group. I think you don't all of a sudden stop being a caregiver when the child turns 3, and you don't stop having an important role in your child's life when they turn 3. So even if you're starting to think about it as more child-directed content, it's more about not a passive experience where the child is just sitting there and being that passive what we tend to do in front of the TV, but more of an interactive experience that encourages activities for the caregivers and children or other children to do together.
One of the other metaphors that we've used it for a long time is the idea of serve and return, which is exactly what Sheila is just talking about. So this idea that that's the interaction that's happening. And so that's what's building the brain. That's what's building language skills and reading skills. So I think this like age appropriate role and whatever media is being used by caregivers, other adults that are in the child's life, books, tablets, it's that, the naming of objects, the fact that there are words associated with that, the fact that you start to be able to decipher that and learn language and those skills over time. It's that interaction. And so I think that's the key. And so no other kind of technology replaces the interaction. They are tools to be used, but it's that interaction that's the piece that's actually doing the brain building work.
Yeah, no, I think that's, the interaction also is something around, there are studies now beginning to come out about, for example, in COVID, and how when kids were away from school, looking at child development under COVID, and when kids were away from school and the other different influences. So outside of maybe an acute crisis in their immediate area that we think of humanitarian, so like maybe not an earthquake or a flood or a conflict or a refugee camp, but even kids in, where I live in Glasgow, and how that might have affected them. And there's increasing idea, I don't know if there's evidence behind it, but there's certainly an idea that there's the rate of developmental delay has, when calling it autism, actually on the autism spectrum, has skyrocketed in the last few years. And there are now studies that are trying to look into, is there a difference with screen time in parents who are not necessarily having the same serve and return, and now that they would have before, trying to cope with something. So maybe tuning out or watching a screen and not having that same interaction with the child that they might previously have done. So this is when we think about coping strategies and what parents do and what they have to do to be able to get through whatever they're experiencing, and how that impacts their ability to do that serve and return. That interaction is really critical. Somebody in the chat, they've written a question, what's a comment, I think, saying, if not the health sector, then who is responsible for supporting nurturing care and caregivers for 0 to 2? And I would very much agree. This is I would be interested to hear your comments on that as well, but I think that's nailing it, basically saying it in a single sentence.
I think, Ayesha, just to build on that, because I think we have to also be careful that we don't put so much pressure on a single sector. Right. We do know that the burdens are there, the stress is there, the capacities may not be there. And so while we would like to see the health and nutrition sector do more than it's doing now, it doesn't mean it has to do everything. And it goes back to what you were saying a little while ago of, the connections between what others are doing around you and the referral pathways, and that's sort of just this wider thing. And then it really doesn't take a lot to ask a question of, how are you doing today? Have you talked to someone about how you're feeling? The very small things that we can do that just show a little bit of care and interest in our everyday interactions in the services that we provide. And that shouldn't be limited to health and nutrition. That should be every service everywhere.
I think that takes us really nicely into the next question. Thank you, Sheila. The next question is, the package of nurturing care is quite comprehensive and mostly challenging for governments to deliver at scale with quality. And so the question is, how can this be incrementally supported over time? With strong nurturing care programs in routine contexts, how can these be implemented in humanitarian contexts? And unless we provide vertical and non-sustainable platforms to deliver services in humanitarian crisis. So they're looking at vertical versus the more sustainable or horizontal, and how can we meaningfully help governments to deliver this at scale and with quality, both in routine context, but also in humanitarian.
So I appreciate the question, and I'm sure you're not alone in thinking that question. And I can say the short answer is, if we had the answer, we would have told you by now, right? And we would have come out with the package that says do X, Y, Z, and you would be ready to go. But the reality is, every situation is a little bit different, right? And it starts with, first, are we even thinking about this? Have we got all the right people around the table thinking about this? And so this is, the people on the front line, as well as all the way up to the people that make decisions about what goes in those response plans and who sets the budgets and who makes those high level decisions. It's those people also that need to be in this conversation. So what we've seen in the last 5 years, and we just released a progress report in June, which was marking the 5 years since the launch of the framework. And sort of the trend in what's happened around the world is there's been a lot of focus around creating awareness and getting buy-in at different levels. So mostly at the high levels of government, and setting up different kinds of structures that make sense in a context to support coordination and collaboration within and across sectors. Right. So here, are your clusters, the health cluster and nutrition cluster, are you working together? Do you think about early childhood in your own cluster? Do you think about it across the clusters? How does that work? What's the operational mechanism for that? When the response plans are being set, are we thinking about this at that point, and thinking about what the gaps might be and where the roles and responsibilities might lie for different things? Scaling is difficult, and scaling, there's not a single place in the world that's really done it yet that can say this is what works, because it really does come down to, in each context, there are different types of providers, different types of needs. So you have to be constantly adapting, and different things come up. So even if you've got it now, 5 years from now, it might look different. So you're constantly improving and iterating on what you have. So it does start with, at minimum, this awareness across all kinds of people, right? It's not limited to a certain group or audience. It's anyone and everyone being part of this conversation. What we've seen is that the framework has provided this common language and this way of talking about early childhood in a way that we haven't before, because for so long we talked about early childhood as something that happens at an early childhood education center. And now we talk about it in a much more holistic way, and we think about those youngest children. So it's using the language that's in the framework, as well as that concept of nurturing care, to bring people together and start thinking about, okay, well, what are we doing and what could we do differently? In the framework, we have 5 strategic actions. And then we have a handbook that goes into those strategic actions in more depth. And so I would encourage you to look at those, and you'll see that in there, the first one is Lead and Invest, which is the one where it's about governance and structural mechanisms and financing. And that's where there's been a lot of action in the recent years. But then you have an action around families and communities and the roles that they play and can play and should play, and what are we doing to include and involve families, communities. Then you have services. What are the services that we need? How do we make them stronger? How do we build the workforce capabilities for that? And then it goes on to data. And then the last one is around scale up and innovate, which is where the digital technologies come in, because they absolutely can help us do more and be more effective in many of these places. So there's not a quick answer. I would say it's a journey that we're all going to be on together. But the more people that start thinking of this as something important, the more people we can work with and problem solve with to take the agenda forward.
Maybe add some reassurance here. Fundamentally, biology is resilient. I mean, that there is an underlying resilience, and that we are seeking adaptation. Biology seeks adaptation for success and survival, right? So collectively, if that wasn't true, we wouldn't be here. So we're actually starting on a basis of some strength. And we have to also understand that even in these most disrupted, most stressed and traumatized environments, folks are managing in some way, right? So that there's a starting point that says we don't have to be perfect. We're actually, I think the thing is, whatever services are available, are they being delivered with as best quality as they can? And to Sheila's point, is there a shared understanding of how this developmental science is understood, so that we're all seeing that whatever we're providing, we're doing it through this kind of thinking and understanding of how it's interacting with that stage of development, and that we need to work with our 1- and 2-year-olds in ways that are sensitive to this and understanding this. It's both the opportunity and challenge, I think, of early childhood, is that it crosses all the sectors. And so that can be massively complicated in terms of coordination. And if each of those who are already providing services to kids and families are sharing this common knowledge base and understanding and sort of framing, then each of those pieces can continue to go. We don't have to create a whole new sector. We don't have to create a whole new set of programs and services. We need to bring an understanding of the developmental timing and process to that work, and then let the services and settings and sectors who are interacting with kids and families at different parts of both age and stage feel like they're equipped to bring this kind of understanding to the work that they do.
Thank you for that. I think this is I think ending on this, we're coming to the close now. So I think ending on this is really important to kind of drive home this understanding of integration. Actually, this is actually about working across sectors so that everybody's workload is less now, and a week from now, and a month from now, and a year from now. I would like to emphasize for health actors in the audience that these a lot of these issues, as we all know, it affects what we see coming through the door in a field hospital or a mobile clinic or everywhere we're working in a crisis center. It also affects what we're faced with when we're trying to discharge a patient home. A child, especially from an isolation and treatment center, or a parent who's disabled back to their children, and what is happening with the children at home when a parent is admitted. So thank you so much for getting us started off. This was a really, really great start to this webinar series, and I'd like to thank all of our participants as well, and especially I'd like to call thank Maria Benavides from the INEE for her wonderful support behind the scenes to make this event happen and to run so smoothly. And there's a whole team who's been building up to this. So the recording of this web event and all related presentations will be shared with all registrants by email. And we'll also send a short survey because we'd like to get your feedback to help us adapt the subsequent webinars and the future work that will come from this to be most useful for everyone. So the link we will put in the chat, if we can, a link to the second webinar, which is about programming and action. We'll give some examples of nurturing care integrated into national health systems, and that's on the 18th of October. So with that, I will finish for now, and thank you, everyone. Looking forward to the next meeting, next webinar, and to work together. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.